The marble floors of the downtown courthouse echoed with the sharp click of expensive heels as Marcus Thornfield strode through the corridors like a man who owned the very building itself. His Armani suit, tailored to perfection, caught the harsh fluorescent lighting as he adjusted his platinum cufflinks with the casual arrogance of someone who had never truly faced consequences. Beside him, Vanessa Mills practically glowed with youth and designer confidence, her red Louboutin soles flashing with each calculated step across the polished stone. If you're watching this from your own courthouse or law office somewhere around the country, you'll recognize this scene. Comment below and let me know what state you're in, because this story of justice served cold happens everywhere, and it might be closer to home than you think. The family court waiting area buzzed with the nervous energy of broken dreams and bitter endings. Lawyers shuffled papers with practiced efficiency while their clients sat rigid in uncomfortable chairs, staring at smartphones or picking at cuticles, anything to avoid eye contact with the person they had once promised to love forever. The air conditioning hummed with mechanical indifference, circulating the sterile atmosphere of a place where love came to die in legal terminology and asset division spreadsheets. Elizabeth Thornfield sat alone on a wooden bench near the far wall, her appearance almost deliberately unremarkable compared to the spectacle Marcus was creating across the room. Her simple navy dress spoke of understated elegance rather than desperate attempts to recapture youth. Her brown leather briefcase, worn but well-maintained, rested beside her like a faithful companion. While Marcus commanded attention with his booming voice and theatrical gestures, Elizabeth observed the room with the quiet intensity of someone who noticed everything but revealed nothing. The contrast could not have been more deliberately orchestrated if Marcus had hired a director. Vanessa, barely 26 and clearly reveling in her role as the victorious replacement, wore a cream-colored Chanel suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. Her platinum blonde hair fell in perfect waves over shoulders that had never carried the weight of 18 years of marriage, mortgage payments, and the slow erosion of trust. She whispered something in Marcus' ear that made him throw back his head and laugh, the sound carrying across the waiting area like a deliberate slap to everyone forced to witness their performance. Elizabeth's fingers traced the edge of her briefcase with unconscious precision, her wedding ring long since removed, but leaving a pale band of skin that told its own story. She had chosen her seat carefully, positioned where she could observe without being the center of attention, where she could watch Marcus preen and posture without having to participate in the theater of their dissolution. Her gray eyes followed his movements with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying a particularly fascinating specimen of male arrogance in its natural habitat. Marcus' attorney, Jonathan Blackwell, swept into the waiting area with the kind of entrance that announced billable hours in the thousands. His briefcase bore the subtle marks of a man who charged premium rates for premium results, and his handshake with Marcus carried the confident grip of someone who had never lost a case like this. Why would he? The story seemed obvious enough to anyone watching. Successful lawyer trades an aging wife for younger model, standard midlife crisis with a legal resolution that would leave the ex-wife with enough to maintain a quiet, diminished existence. The whispers started almost immediately among the other waiting couples and their representatives. Trophy wife. Midlife crisis. She should have seen it coming. Poor thing, probably never worked a day in her life. He'll pay through the nose for that little blonde, but he can afford it. The murmurs followed predictable patterns, the same tired narratives that played out in family courts across the country every single day. Vanessa seemed to feed on the attention like exotic flora, thriving in hothouse conditions. She adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet, a gift Marcus had given her for their 6-month anniversary, and crossed her legs with the deliberate precision of someone who understood the power of being watched. Her manicured nails, painted in a shade called Victory Red, drummed against her phone case as she scrolled through social media, probably updating her followers about her morning adventure in legal vindication. Elizabeth, by contrast, appeared almost invisible in her corner, which was exactly how she preferred it. Her own attorney, Patricia Fleming, represented a different breed entirely. Where Blackwell wore custom-tailored dominance, Fleming projected competent efficiency in an off-the-rack suit that suggested hourly rates rather than retainer fees. The courtroom observers would naturally assume Elizabeth had been forced to economize in her legal representation, another sign of her reduced circumstances and limited options. The bailiff emerged from the courtroom doors with military bearing, his voice cutting through the morning chatter like a blade. Court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Catherine Morrison presiding. All parties in the matter of Thornfield versus Thornfield, please approach the bench for preliminary instructions. The moment had arrived with bureaucratic inevitability, the culmination of months of legal maneuvering and bitter negotiations that had brought them to this sterile chamber where their marriage would be dissected like a specimen in a laboratory. Marcus rose with theatrical flourish, extending his arm to Vanessa as if escorting her to a premiere rather than a legal proceeding. She beamed up at him with practiced adoration, her hand resting on his forearm with possessive confidence. They moved toward the courtroom doors like conquering royalty, accepting the stares and whispered comments as their due. This was their moment of triumph, the legal formalization of Marcus' escape from his dreary domestic obligations into a more exciting future. Elizabeth gathered her briefcase with methodical care, her movements betraying none of the emotion that lesser women might have displayed in such circumstances. She followed behind the couple at a respectful distance, her low heels silent on the marble floor. Patricia Fleming walked beside her, carrying a modest stack of folders that seemed almost apologetic compared to the wheeled cases Blackwell's team had brought for their comprehensive assault on Elizabeth's financial future. The courtroom itself embodied the cold majesty of justice, with its dark wood paneling and elevated bench that placed Judge Morrison above the petty concerns of mortal relationships. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the gallery where a handful of observers had gathered to witness the proceedings. Some were law students seeking education in the art of divorce litigation. Others appeared to be court regulars, drawn by the same instinct that made people slow down to observe highway accidents. Judge Morrison entered with the measured dignity of someone who had presided over countless similar proceedings, her black robes flowing as she took her position behind the bench. Her sharp eyes surveyed the assembled parties with professional detachment, noting the obvious dynamics at play in this particular dissolution. She had seen this story before, would see it again, and her primary concern was ensuring that justice emerged from the emotional wreckage with appropriate legal precision. Marcus straightened his already perfect tie and flashed his most persuasive smile, the same expression that had charmed juries and intimidated opposing counsel throughout his successful career. Vanessa settled into the gallery with feline satisfaction, her eyes bright with anticipation of watching her predecessor be officially relegated to history. The stage was set, the players in position, and the curtain ready to rise on what promised to be a swift and decisive legal victory. Elizabeth opened her briefcase with quiet efficiency, removing a thick folder that she placed on the table before her. The motion was unremarkable, almost invisible amid the grander gestures occurring around her, but her fingers lingered on the folder edge with the satisfaction of someone who had prepared thoroughly for this exact moment. The real performance was about to begin, though only one person in the courtroom understood the true nature of the show they were about to witness. Jonathan Blackwell rose from his chair with the measured confidence of a predator approaching wounded prey, his Italian leather shoes silent on the courtroom carpet as he approached the podium. He adjusted his silk tie with deliberate precision, allowing a moment of theatrical silence to build anticipation for what promised to be a masterclass in character assassination disguised as legal advocacy. His opening statement would set the tone for everything that followed, and he had crafted it with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly how to dismantle a reputation in broad daylight. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying the cultured authority of generations of privilege, "we are here today to resolve what is fundamentally a simple matter of marital dissolution between parties whose contributions to the union were vastly disproportionate. My client, Marcus Thornfield, spent 18 years building a successful legal career while supporting a spouse who chose domesticity over productivity, comfort over contribution." Elizabeth sat perfectly still as Blackwell painted his portrait of her life, his words falling like drops of acid on her public reputation. According to his narrative, she had been little more than an expensive pet, fed and housed and clothed in exchange for basic household management and social companionship. He spoke of her as if she were a luxury Marcus had indulged himself in during his younger years, a beautiful but ultimately frivolous expense that he could no longer justify as he entered his more practical middle age. The attorney gestured toward an easel where his assistant had arranged a timeline that began conveniently in the year 2019, showing Marcus' legal career flourishing while Elizabeth's activities remained conspicuously absent from the professional record. No law degree, he emphasized, tapping the poster with his laser pointer. No business ownership. No patents or intellectual property. No investment portfolio managed independently. Mrs. Thornfield's lifestyle has been entirely subsidized by her husband's generosity for nearly 2 decades. Vanessa leaned forward in her gallery seat, her diamond earrings catching the courtroom lights as she absorbed every word with visible satisfaction. She had dressed for the occasion in understated elegance, understanding that appearing too triumphant might generate sympathy for Elizabeth, but her inner glow of vindication was impossible to completely conceal. This was her moment of validation, the legal confirmation that she represented Marcus' upgrade rather than his moral downgrade. Each witness Blackwell called painted another brushstroke in his masterpiece of domestic irrelevance. Marcus' golf partner testified about Elizabeth's absence from business dinners and networking events. Their former housekeeper, clearly uncomfortable but legally compelled, described a woman who spent her days reading, gardening, and managing household staff rather than pursuing meaningful employment. The country club manager spoke of Elizabeth's presence at charity luncheons and book clubs, activities that Blackwell dismissed as expensive hobbies rather than substantive contributions to society. Patricia Fleming objected when possible, but her protests seemed half-hearted, as if she understood the futility of defending against such overwhelming circumstantial evidence. Her client appeared to have lived exactly the life Blackwell was describing, and no amount of legal maneuvering could transform voluntary domesticity into economic partnership. The court reporter fingers flew across her stenotype machine, capturing every devastating detail for the permanent record. Marcus himself took the witness stand with the confident bearing of a man who had never doubted his own righteousness. Under Blackwell's gentle questioning, he presented himself as a devoted provider who had given Elizabeth every advantage life could offer. "I worked 70-hour weeks," he testified, his voice heavy with the burden of unappreciated sacrifice. "I built my practice from nothing, took every case, worked holidays and weekends so Elizabeth could enjoy the lifestyle she preferred." He spoke of their marriage as if describing a charitable organization he had funded out of misplaced loyalty. Elizabeth wanted to focus on the home, he explained to the rapt courtroom, and I supported that choice completely. I never asked her to work. I encouraged her interests in literature and volunteer work. I made sure she had everything she needed to pursue whatever made her happy. But 18 years later, when I look at what we built together, I have to acknowledge that the building was done entirely by me. The timeline he presented showed his meteoric rise in the legal profession, his successful partnership acquisition, his development of a client base that generated 7-figure annual revenues. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's section of their shared chronology remained notably blank, a white space that spoke more eloquently than any testimony about her failure to contribute meaningfully to their joint success. Vanessa nodded approvingly from her seat, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light as she followed Marcus' testimony with devoted attention. She had heard these stories before during their intimate conversations, but having them validated in open court by a judge added official weight to her understanding of their relationship dynamics. Marcus was a victim of his own generosity, trapped by outdated notions of husbandly duty to a woman who had taken advantage of his success for nearly 2 decades. Elizabeth's lawyer rose for cross-examination with what appeared to be resignation rather than strategic confidence. Her questions seemed designed more to demonstrate that she had attempted a defense rather than to actually challenge the narrative Blackwell had so carefully constructed. She asked about household management responsibilities, about Elizabeth's role in entertaining Marcus' business associates, about the emotional support that sustained a demanding legal career, but these inquiries only reinforced the impression that Elizabeth's contributions had been domestic rather than economic. The judge listened with professional attention but growing impatience as Fleming struggled to establish any concrete evidence of Elizabeth's financial participation in their marriage success. The law recognized emotional support and domestic management as valuable, certainly, but it also acknowledged the practical reality that professional achievement required professional effort, and all evidence suggested that such effort had been provided exclusively by Marcus throughout their union. When Fleming asked about Elizabeth's education, Marcus' attorney objected before his client could fully explain her academic background, claiming relevance issues that the judge sustained without lengthy consideration. When she inquired about family financial planning, Blackwell again intervened successfully, arguing that such questions exceeded the scope of established testimony. Each potential avenue of defense seemed to close before Elizabeth's story could emerge from behind the carefully constructed wall of Marcus' professional accomplishments. Vanessa whispered something to her companion in the gallery, another young woman who had accompanied her for moral support during this legal vindication. Their shared laughter was quickly suppressed, but not before several jurors noticed the casual disrespect being shown to the proceedings. Judge Morrison's sharp glance in their direction brought immediate silence, though Vanessa continued to radiate satisfaction like expensive perfume filling the courtroom atmosphere. Marcus concluded his testimony by expressing genuine regret about the marriage failure, while maintaining that he had fulfilled every reasonable expectation of partnership support. "I gave Elizabeth 18 wonderful years," he declared with apparent sincerity. "I hope she can find happiness in whatever direction her life takes next, but I believe I have more than satisfied any obligation created by our union." His performance was masterful, projecting wounded nobility rather than selfish abandonment. The courtroom observers murmured approvingly as Marcus returned to his seat, their sympathies clearly aligned with the successful professional who had been taken advantage of by an opportunistic spouse. Even the bailiff seemed more respectful in his interactions with Marcus' team, unconsciously recognizing the authority that comes with demonstrated achievement and financial success. Elizabeth maintained her composure throughout the systematic destruction of her public reputation, her hands folded calmly in her lap as witness after witness testified to her apparent uselessness as an economic partner. Her gray eyes remained fixed on the proceedings with the detached interest of someone watching a particularly involving theatrical performance, though whether this represented emotional numbness or strategic patience remained unclear to the casual observer. Fleming attempted one final gambit by requesting permission to present additional documentation regarding the marriage financial history, but Blackwell objected on grounds that such materials should have been submitted during discovery. Judge Morrison sustained the objection with evident irritation, noting that court time could not be wasted on attorney preparation failures. The morning session concluded with Elizabeth's case appearing not merely weak, but virtually non-existent. As the court recessed for lunch, Vanessa practically glowed with vindicated triumph. She rose gracefully from her seat and moved to Marcus' side with the fluid confidence of a woman whose position had been legally validated by the state judicial system. Their embrace was brief but public, a declaration that their relationship represented an upgrade rather than a betrayal for everyone watching to witness and remember. Elizabeth gathered her papers with methodical precision, her movements betraying none of the humiliation that lesser women might have displayed after such comprehensive public dismantling. She placed her folder back in her briefcase with the same careful attention she had shown throughout the morning, though her fingers lingered on the leather surface for just a moment longer than strictly necessary, as if drawing comfort from its familiar texture. The lunch recess would provide time for both sides to prepare for the afternoon session, though most observers assumed the case outcome had already been determined by the morning testimony. Marcus' legal team seemed to have constructed an unassailable narrative of professional success subsidizing domestic luxury, while Elizabeth's defense appeared to rest on outdated notions of domestic partnership that modern courts had largely abandoned in favor of economic reality. But experienced courtroom observers might have noticed something interesting about Elizabeth's demeanor during her public humiliation. Rather than displaying the devastation or desperate anger that characterized most spouses in similar circumstances, she had watched the proceedings with the focused attention of someone taking notes for a future examination. Her composure suggested either emotional detachment or supreme confidence in information that had not yet been presented to the court. The afternoon session began with the kind of post-lunch lethargy that typically favored whichever side had already established momentum, and by all appearances that advantage belonged decisively to Marcus and his legal team. The courtroom had the settled atmosphere of a trial whose outcome had already been determined by the morning testimony, requiring only the formality of closing arguments and judicial rubber stamping to make the obvious conclusion official. Patricia Fleming rose from her seat with a deliberate slowness that seemed to acknowledge her client's hopeless position, her modest briefcase appearing even more humble beside Blackwell's elaborate presentation materials. She approached the witness stand where Marcus still sat with relaxed confidence, his expensive suit unwrinkled despite hours of testimony, his smile ready to deflect whatever feeble attempts at contradiction Elizabeth's attorney might attempt. "Mr. Thornfield," Fleming began, her voice carrying an unexpected clarity that cut through the somnolent courtroom atmosphere. "I would like to clarify a few details about your business timeline for the court record. Nothing dramatic, just some basic chronology to ensure we have accurate dates for the judge's final determination." Marcus nodded magnanimously, his expression suggesting patient tolerance for questions he considered irrelevant to the case outcome. "Of course," he replied, adjusting his platinum cufflinks with casual authority. "I am happy to provide whatever clarification the court requires regarding my professional development." Fleming consulted a single page of handwritten notes with the unhurried precision of someone following a carefully planned script. "When exactly was Thornfield Associates formally incorporated as a limited liability partnership, and who were the founding members listed in the original filing documents?" The question seemed harmless enough, the kind of routine inquiry that divorce attorneys made to establish asset timelines for division purposes. Marcus straightened slightly in his chair, his confident smile flickering momentarily as he calculated the safest response. "The partnership was formalized in 2019, he answered after a brief pause, though his voice carried less certainty than it had during Blackwell-guided questioning. "And the founding members," Fleming pressed gently, maintaining the same conversational tone that suggested professional curiosity rather than strategic attack. "Who appears on the incorporation paperwork filed with the State Business Registration Office?" Marcus glanced toward Blackwell's table, seeking guidance that was not immediately forthcoming since the question appeared routine and harmless. "Myself and my two senior associates, David Chun and Margaret Williams," he replied, though careful observers might have noticed that his hands had moved from relaxed display to defensive positioning in his lap. Fleming nodded with apparent satisfaction, making a small note on her pad before continuing with the same measured pace. "And your firm client list, the major accounts that generate the bulk of your annual revenue. When were those relationships first established?" "I am thinking particularly of your three largest clients, the ones that represent approximately 60% of your current business volume." The courtroom remained quiet, but a subtle tension had begun to permeate the atmosphere as Marcus' hesitation became more pronounced. "Some of those relationships developed gradually," he said carefully, his previous fluency replaced by cautious word selection. "Business development is an ongoing process that spans multiple years in most professional practices." Fleming smiled with what appeared to be understanding rather than challenge. "Of course, business relationships do evolve over time. But I am asking specifically about initial contact dates, the first meetings or referrals that led to these major client relationships. For instance, when did you first meet with Harrison Development Group, your largest current client?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair, his confident posture beginning to betray signs of stress that had been completely absent during his morning testimony. "Harrison Development was referred to us through existing professional networks," he answered vaguely, avoiding the specific dates Fleming had requested. Vanessa leaned forward in her gallery seat, her previous satisfaction now tempered by growing concern as she watched Marcus struggle with questions that should have been simple for someone describing his own professional history. Her manicured fingers clutched her designer handbag with unconscious tension, her bright smile fading as she sensed something changing in the courtroom dynamics. Fleming maintained her patient demeanor, consulting her notes with the methodical attention of someone working through a comprehensive checklist. "Could you be more specific about the time frame, Mr. Thornfield?" Was that initial Harrison development referral closer to 2018, 2015, perhaps even earlier? These dates matter for establishing the complete timeline of marital asset development. Blackwell finally recognized the danger developing in his client testimony and rose with practiced authority. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is asking for detailed business development information that was not included in her discovery requests. This level of granular questioning exceeds the scope of relevant testimony for marital asset determination. Judge Morrison considered the objection with visible interest, her sharp eyes moving between the two attorneys as she sensed the emergence of something more substantial than routine divorce proceedings. The objection is noted but overruled, she announced with crisp authority. Mrs. Fleming questions appear relevant to establishing the chronology of business development that Mr. Thornfield has presented as entirely self-generated. The witness will answer the question. Marcus' face had begun to show perspiration despite the courtroom air conditioning, his previous composure cracking under pressure that seemed disproportionate to Fleming's simple chronological inquiries. The Harrison relationship began approximately 8 years ago, he admitted reluctantly, though his voice suggested uncertainty about even this basic time frame. 8 years ago, Fleming repeated thoughtfully, making another notation on her pad. That would place the initial contact in approximately 2016, 3 years before your formal partnership incorporation and well before the business timeline you presented this morning. Does that discrepancy concern you at all, Mr. Thornfield? Elizabeth opened her briefcase with quiet efficiency and removed a thick folder that she passed forward to her attorney with the fluid coordination of a team that had rehearsed this exact moment. Fleming accepted the document without breaking stride in her questioning, though Marcus' eyes fixed on the folder with unmistakable alarm as he recognized that his wife had been preparing more thoroughly than anyone had anticipated. Your Honor, Fleming announced with newfound confidence, I would like to present a complete financial and business timeline covering the entire duration of the Thornfield marriage, not merely the abbreviated version provided by opposing counsel. This comprehensive chronology includes incorporation dates, client acquisition records, and detailed financial documentation spanning 20 years of partnership between my client and her husband. Blackwell shot to his feet with desperate urgency, his previous theatrical confidence replaced by genuine concern. Objection, Your Honor. This appears to be new evidence that was not disclosed during discovery proceedings. The defense cannot introduce surprise documentation at this stage of the trial without proper advance notice to opposing counsel. Judge Morrison leaned forward with obvious interest, her judicial instincts activated by the suggestion that crucial information had been withheld from the court record. Mrs. Fleming, she inquired sharply, why is this comprehensive timeline only being presented now? Was this documentation available during discovery proceedings? Fleming maintained her calm professionalism while delivering what amounted to a devastating counterattack. Your Honor, all requested financial documentation was provided to opposing counsel during discovery. However, Mr. Thornfield's timeline began conveniently in 2019, 5 years after his marriage began, and his attorney specifically limited discovery requests to exclude earlier business development records. My client's complete timeline simply fills in the deliberately omitted information. The courtroom atmosphere shifted perceptibly as observers began to understand that they were witnessing something more complex than a routine divorce proceeding. Marcus had gone pale beneath his expensive tan, his hands gripping the witness chair arms with white-knuckled tension as he realized that his carefully constructed narrative was beginning to unravel in ways he had not anticipated. Vanessa exchanged her first worried glance with Marcus, her previous triumph now replaced by growing anxiety as she sensed that the morning legal victory might have been premature. The timeline document Fleming held appeared substantial enough to contain genuine surprises, and Marcus' obvious discomfort suggested that those surprises would not favor their position. Judge Morrison examined both attorneys with the calculating attention of someone who had presided over enough trials to recognize when important information was being deliberately concealed. I will allow preliminary review of this timeline documentation, she announced with authority that brooked no further objection. If it contains relevant information that was improperly excluded from earlier proceedings, the court has an obligation to consider all pertinent evidence before making final determinations. Fleming approached the bench with measured confidence, carrying the folder that had materialized from Elizabeth's briefcase like evidence in a criminal prosecution rather than supporting documentation in a civil divorce. She handed copies to both the judge and Blackwell, whose face showed increasing dismay as he quickly scanned the comprehensive chronology his own discovery process had somehow missed. The timeline Fleming had produced began in 2005, the year Marcus and Elizabeth were married, and continued through 2025 with meticulous detail that included business incorporation dates, client acquisition records, financial milestones, and professional development markers that painted a dramatically different picture of their marriage partnership than the abbreviated version Blackwell had presented to the court. Marcus stared at the document with horrified recognition, understanding that 18 years of carefully managed information was about to be exposed in forensic detail before a judge who had the authority to redistribute their entire marital estate based on evidence he had assumed would never see daylight. His confident morning testimony now seemed like a transparent attempt to deceive the court through strategic omission. Fleming returned to her position with visible satisfaction, though she maintained her professional demeanor as she prepared to systematically dismantle the narrative that had seemed so convincing only hours earlier. Mr. Thornfield, she began with renewed authority. Looking at this complete timeline spanning your entire marriage, would you like to revise any of your earlier testimony about business development and financial contribution during your partnership with my client? The question hung in the courtroom air like a blade suspended over Marcus' remaining credibility, while Vanessa clutched her handbag with dawning realization that the legal proceedings had taken an unexpected and potentially devastating turn. The afternoon session that had begun as a formality was transforming into something that threatened to expose truths that both she and Marcus had assumed would remain safely buried in the past. Patricia Fleming moved to the easel that Blackwell had used for his morning presentation and began replacing his abbreviated timeline with a comprehensive chronological display that stretched across multiple poster boards. The detailed documentation she unveiled told a dramatically different story than the narrative of professional self-sufficiency that Marcus had presented to the court with such confident authority only hours earlier. "Let us begin at the actual beginning," Fleming announced with calm precision, pointing to the first entry on her expanded timeline. In September 2005, 3 months after their wedding, Elizabeth Thornfield provided a cashier check for $47,000 to Georgetown University Law School to cover her husband's complete tuition for his final year of education. This payment came from her personal trust fund, established by her grandmother estate when Elizabeth turned 21. Marcus' face went ashen as Fleming presented the canceled check image on a large display screen, showing Elizabeth's signature authorizing payment for educational expenses he had never acknowledged in his testimony. The document was official, undeniable, and completely contradicted his narrative of self-funded professional development that had supposedly justified his claim to independent business ownership. Vanessa gripped the edge of her gallery bench with white-knuckled tension, her previous satisfaction evaporating as she realized that the man she had seen as a successful provider had actually been subsidized by the wife he was now attempting to discard. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the courtroom lights as her hands trembled with the shock of discovering that Marcus' entire professional foundation rested on Elizabeth's financial support. The timeline continued with methodical precision through 2006, when Elizabeth Trust Fund provided the down payment for their first home in Arlington, a property that Marcus had claimed represented his professional success milestone. Fleming presented mortgage documents showing Elizabeth as the primary borrower, her credit score and financial assets qualifying them for premium lending rates that Marcus' income alone could not have secured. In 2007, Fleming continued, gesturing to bank records displayed on the courtroom screen. Elizabeth established Meridian Consulting Services as a limited liability company specializing in strategic planning for nonprofit organizations. Her client list included 3 major foundations and 2 university endowments, generating annual revenues between $90,000 and $150,000 throughout the first decade of their marriage. Judge Morrison leaned forward with obvious interest as the evidence mounted, her previous assumptions about Elizabeth's domestic role crumbling under the weight of documented professional achievement that had somehow been completely absent from Marcus' morning testimony. The consulting business records showed a sophisticated operation with impressive client retention rates and steady revenue growth over multiple years. Blackwell attempted damage control by objecting to the relevance of Elizabeth's business activities, but Judge Morrison overruled him sharply, noting that professional contributions by either spouse were fundamental to marital asset determination. The court needs to understand the complete financial picture of this marriage, she declared with authority that left no room for further obstruction. Fleming advanced through the timeline to 2008, when Thornfield Associates was first conceptualized as a business venture. The incorporation documents she presented to the court showed Elizabeth as a founding member alongside Marcus, contributing $40,000 in startup capital, while Marcus provided $15,000 and his legal credentials. Their initial partnership agreement designated Elizabeth as the business development director responsible for client acquisition and strategic planning. Marcus had begun sweating visibly despite the courthouse air conditioning, his expensive suit clinging uncomfortably as he realized that every aspect of his professional success story was being systematically dismantled by documentation he had hoped would never surface. His confident demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled panic as Fleming methodically revealed the true foundation of his career achievements. The business development records Fleming presented next showed Elizabeth networking activities throughout Washington professional circles, leveraging her family connections and nonprofit consulting relationships to generate referrals for the fledgling law practice. Her detailed client contact logs documented dozens of introductions that had resulted in major accounts, including the Harrison Development Group relationship that Marcus had claimed as his own achievement. Vanessa watched with growing horror as each revelation diminished Marcus from successful professional to subsidized beneficiary of his wife's expertise and financial resources. The man she had seen as her upgrade from ordinary circumstances was being exposed as someone whose entire lifestyle had been funded by the woman he was attempting to discard. Her face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her previous confidence replaced by dawning realization of her massive miscalculation. Fleming presented patent documentation from 2011 showing Elizabeth as co-inventor on 3 legal process innovations that had become cornerstone services for Thornfield Associates. Her contributions to intellectual property development included the systematic case management software that had given their firm competitive advantages in handling complex litigation, generating hundreds of thousands in additional revenue over subsequent years. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted completely as observers realized they were witnessing the exposure of financial fraud disguised as marital dissolution. Marcus' attempt to claim sole ownership of business assets was being revealed as an elaborate deception designed to cheat Elizabeth out of partnership interests she had legitimately earned through years of professional contribution and financial investment. Judge Morrison's attention had focused entirely on Fleming's presentation, her judicial instincts activated by evidence of deliberate asset concealment that went far beyond typical divorce settlement disputes. "Mrs. Fleming," she inquired with sharp interest, "are you suggesting that Mr. Thornfield has systematically misrepresented the ownership structure of marital assets to this court?" Fleming nodded gravely, her professional composure intact despite the explosive nature of her revelations. "Your Honor, the evidence shows that Thornfield Associates was built entirely on my client financial investment, business development efforts, and intellectual property contributions. Mr. Thornfield's attempt to claim sole ownership represents not merely marital misconduct, but potential fraud against both my client and this court." The timeline advanced through 2012 when Elizabeth Trust Fund provided bridge financing that kept Thornfield Associates operational during a cash flow crisis that would have bankrupted the practice without her intervention. Bank records showed her personal guarantee on business loans totaling $200,000. Financial exposure that Marcus had never acknowledged despite benefiting from the stability it provided to their joint venture. Marcus' attorney attempted increasingly desperate objections as each new revelation further undermined his client credibility, But Judge Morrison was clearly following the documentary evidence with professional fascination rather than boredom. Blackwell's theatrical confidence had been replaced by damage control mode as he realized that his carefully constructed morning narrative was collapsing under the weight of actual financial records. The consulting business records Fleming presented showed Elizabeth generating substantial independent income throughout their marriage while simultaneously funding Marcus' professional development and business expansion. Her nonprofit clients had included major philanthropic organizations whose boards contained influential business leaders, networking opportunities that had generated referrals worth millions in legal fees for Thornfield Associates over the years. Vanessa had begun crying quietly in the gallery, mascara streaking down her cheeks as she absorbed the full implications of what Fleming documentation revealed about her relationship with Marcus. The man she had seen as her financial security had actually been living off his wife's income and connections, making Vanessa not an upgrade, but simply another expense in Elizabeth's business portfolio. Fleming presented real estate records from 2015 showing Elizabeth purchasing their current home in her name only, using proceeds from a major consulting contract, while Marcus contributed nothing to the down payment. The mortgage documents listed her as sole borrower, her income qualifying them for a luxury property that represented their most valuable marital asset. The intellectual property documentation Fleming revealed next showed Elizabeth authoring 3 law review articles that had established Marcus' reputation in corporate litigation, work that had generated speaking engagements and consulting opportunities worth hundreds of thousands in additional revenue. Her legal research and writing had created the professional credibility that Marcus now claimed as his independent achievement. Marcus had begun shaking in the witness chair, his polished professional image crumbling as each document Fleming presented revealed another layer of his dependence on Elizabeth's financial support and professional expertise. His morning testimony about supporting a non-productive spouse was being exposed as projection, with the actual financial dependency flowing in exactly the opposite direction. The timeline continued through 2018 when Elizabeth Trust Fund provided expansion capital that allowed Thornfield Associates to open their prestigious downtown office location. Her investment had funded the renovation, equipment purchases, and marketing campaign that positioned the firm as a major player in Washington legal circles, growth that Marcus had attributed entirely to his professional competence. Fleming approached the final section of her timeline presentation with measured satisfaction, having systematically demolished every aspect of Marcus' credibility through documentary evidence that painted him not as a generous provider, but as a sophisticated financial parasite who had been planning to abandon his benefactor after extracting maximum value from their partnership. Judge Morrison had taken extensive notes throughout Fleming's presentation, her expression showing professional outrage at the scope of deception that had been attempted in her courtroom. The evidence suggested not merely asset hiding, but systematic fraud designed to cheat Elizabeth out of business interests she had legitimately earned through substantial financial investment and professional contribution over nearly 2 decades. Blackwell's final objection was overruled before he could complete his argument, Judge Morrison having clearly heard enough evidence to understand that Marcus' morning testimony had been carefully crafted to conceal rather than reveal the true nature of their marital financial partnership. The courtroom had fallen completely silent except for Vanessa's quiet sobbing as she realized that everything she had believed about Marcus' success and independence had been an elaborate illusion. Elizabeth maintained her composed dignity throughout Fleming's devastating presentation, though careful observers might have noticed the slight upturn at the corners of her mouth as 18 years of hidden contributions were finally acknowledged in open court. Her gray eyes remained fixed on Marcus with the satisfaction of someone whose patience and preparation were about to be vindicated in the most public and complete manner possible. The timeline Fleming had presented painted an undeniable picture of Elizabeth as the driving force behind every aspect of Marcus' professional success, from his education funding through business development, intellectual property creation, and ongoing financial support that had made their lifestyle possible. His attempt to claim independent achievement had been exposed as fraud disguised as masculine achievement narrative. Marcus sat in the witness chair like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. understanding that his carefully planned escape from marriage obligations had instead become a public exhibition of his professional and financial dependence on the woman he had attempted to discard. The timeline had revealed not his generosity toward Elizabeth, but her extraordinary generosity toward him, charity that he had repaid with betrayal and attempted theft. Fleming advanced to the final section of her timeline presentation with the measured confidence of someone delivering a knockout blow to an already staggered opponent. Her next revelation promising to destroy not only Marcus' remaining credibility, but also Vanessa's carefully maintained position as innocent beneficiary of his professional success. The documents she prepared to present would transform the courtroom narrative from marital dissolution to criminal fraud exposure. Your Honor, Fleming announced with grave authority, I would now like to present evidence regarding the timeline of Mr. Thornfield's relationship with Ms. Mills, and more importantly, the financial methodology used to fund their association while he was systematically attempting to conceal marital assets from my client and this court. Vanessa straightened in her gallery seat with sudden alarm, her tear-streaked makeup unable to conceal the growing panic in her eyes as she realized that her relationship with Marcus was about to be subjected to the same forensic scrutiny that had already destroyed his professional credibility. Her designer handbag clutched in white-knuckled hands as Fleming approached a new display screen loaded with financial records. The relationship timeline Fleming presented showed Marcus' first contact with Vanessa in January 2023, nearly 2 years before their supposed separation, completely contradicting his testimony about their marriage ending due to natural drift rather than deliberate betrayal. Credit card records displayed on the courtroom screen showed expensive restaurant charges, hotel bookings, and luxury purchases that corresponded exactly with the developing affair timeline. Marcus had gone beyond pale to a sickly gray color, his hands trembling as he watched Fleming methodically expose every aspect of his carefully concealed deception. The financial evidence showed him using joint credit cards and business accounts to fund lavish gifts for Vanessa, while simultaneously claiming to the court that Elizabeth had contributed nothing to their marital partnership success. Fleming presented jewelry purchase records from Tiffany totaling $43,000. Charged to the Thornfield Associates business account between March and December 2023. The items purchased matched exactly the diamond tennis bracelet, emerald earrings, and sapphire pendant that Vanessa was currently wearing in court, transforming her symbols of Marcus' affection into evidence of systematic marital asset theft. Vanessa's face had gone completely white as she realized that every gift Marcus had given her, every luxury experience they had shared, every symbol of his devotion and financial success had been stolen from Elizabeth's accounts without her knowledge. She was not Marcus' generous lover, but his unknowing accomplice in organized theft from the woman now sitting calmly across the courtroom. The hotel records Fleming displayed showed Marcus charging luxury suites and weekend getaways to business expense accounts, claiming them as client entertainment while actually using them for romantic excursions with Vanessa. The detailed credit card statements revealed spa treatments, designer clothing purchases, and expensive dinners that had nothing to do with legitimate business activities and everything to do with funding his affair. Judge Morrison's expression had shifted from professional interest to barely controlled outrage as the scope of Marcus' deception became clear. He had not merely hidden assets during divorce proceedings, but had actively stolen marital funds to finance infidelity while claiming his wife had never contributed to their financial success. The evidence suggested systematic fraud that went far beyond typical divorce settlement disputes. Fleming presented mortgage documents showing that their luxury home remained titled exclusively in Elizabeth's name, despite Marcus' testimony claiming it as joint marital property subject to division. Real estate records revealed Elizabeth had purchased the property using inheritance funds before their marriage, then maintained separate ownership throughout their relationship while allowing Marcus to live there as her guest. The investment portfolio documentation Fleming revealed next showed Elizabeth maintaining separate brokerage accounts worth over $2 million, funds that Marcus had attempted to claim as marital property despite having never contributed to their acquisition. Her financial independence had been complete throughout their marriage, making his claims of supporting her lifestyle not merely false but fraudulent. Marcus' business partnership agreements with Chun and Williams, when examined closely, revealed Elizabeth as the primary capital contributor who had provided startup funding, ongoing operational support, and the networking connections that generated their major client relationships. The legal documents showed Marcus as junior partner despite his claims of sole ownership, his position dependent entirely on Elizabeth's continued financial backing. Vanessa had begun sobbing openly as the full implications of Fleming revelations destroyed her understanding of everything she had believed about Marcus and their relationship. She was not his successful girlfriend, but his unknowing victim, seduced with stolen money and led to believe she was participating in legitimate romance rather than organized theft from his wife. Fleming presented evidence of Marcus attempting to transfer business assets into offshore accounts established under false business entities, systematic asset hiding that violated court orders, and potentially constituted criminal fraud. The financial trail showed him moving money through shell companies in apparent preparation for divorce proceedings that would claim he had minimal assets to divide. The forensic accounting records Fleming displayed revealed Marcus had systematically understated business income on legal documents while maintaining accurate books that showed revenues triple what he had reported to the court. His attempt to impoverish Elizabeth through false financial declarations was being exposed as perjury combined with attempted grand theft of marital assets. Judge Morrison had stopped taking notes and was staring directly at Marcus with undisguised contempt, her judicial composure strained by evidence of deliberate court deception combined with systematic theft from a spouse who had actually funded the defendant's entire professional success. The scope of his deception exceeded anything she had encountered in decades of family court proceedings. Fleming presented the final devastating evidence showing Elizabeth had discovered Marcus' affair 18 months earlier but had chosen to document his activities rather than confront him immediately, understanding that his pattern of deception would likely extend to divorce proceedings. Her private investigator reports detailed every restaurant, every hotel, every gift purchase that Marcus had charged to accounts she ultimately funded. The telecommunications records Fleming displayed showed Marcus using business phone accounts to coordinate with divorce attorneys months before supposedly deciding their marriage was over, evidence of premeditated planning to defraud Elizabeth while maintaining access to her financial resources until the last possible moment. His careful preparation made his deception appear calculated rather than impulsive. Vanessa rose unsteadily from her gallery seat and moved toward the courtroom exit, her face streaked with mascara and her designer clothing wrinkled from nervous tension. She could no longer bear to sit in the same room where every aspect of her relationship was being revealed as elaborate theft from a woman who had been unknowingly funding their entire romantic fantasy through stolen marital assets. Marcus watched his girlfriend flee with the expression of a man whose entire world was collapsing in real time, understanding that he had lost not only his wife and his assets, but also the woman for whom he had sacrificed everything. His carefully planned escape from marital responsibilities had become a public exhibition of fraud, theft, and betrayal that would likely result in criminal charges rather than favorable divorce settlement. Fleming presented Elizabeth credit reports showing her excellent financial standing maintained independently throughout their marriage, debunking Marcus' claims that she had been financially dependent on his support. Her business income, investment returns, and trust fund distributions had actually exceeded his earnings in most years, making his support claims not merely false but laughable. The property ownership records Fleming displayed as her final evidence showed Elizabeth retaining title to their vacation home, their primary residence, and the office building that housed Thornfield Associates. Marcus had been living and working in properties she owned while claiming to be her financial provider, a level of deception that transformed their divorce from marital dispute into potential criminal prosecution. Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair with visible disgust, having witnessed what amounted to comprehensive fraud disguised as divorce proceedings. The evidence Fleming had presented revealed Marcus not as generous husband seeking freedom, but as sophisticated criminal who had systematically stolen from his wife while planning to abandon her with fabricated claims of financial independence. Elizabeth maintained her dignified composure throughout the devastating exposure of her husband's betrayal, though careful observers might have noticed the slight satisfaction in her gray eyes as 18 years of concealed truth finally received public acknowledgement. Her patient documentation of Marcus' deception was proving its worth in the most spectacular and complete vindication possible. The courtroom had fallen into stunned silence as the full scope of Marcus' deception became clear to everyone present, from court reporters to casual observers who had expected routine divorce proceedings but instead witnessed the exposure of systematic fraud. His confident morning testimony now seemed like evidence of pathological deception rather than legitimate legal argument. Blackwell sat at his table with the defeated expression of an attorney who had unknowingly participated in presenting fraudulent evidence to a judge, his client deception so complete that even his own legal representative had been victimized by the false narrative. His professional reputation would likely require years to recover from association with such comprehensive client fraud. Fleming returned to her table with quiet satisfaction, having systematically demolished every aspect of Marcus' credibility while establishing Elizabeth as not merely the victim of adultery, but the target of sophisticated financial crime disguised as marital dissolution. Her client patience and thorough preparation had produced the most complete legal victory possible under circumstances that could have resulted in devastating loss. Marcus remained in the witness chair like a condemned man awaiting sentencing, understanding that his attempt to escape marital obligations through deception had instead exposed him to criminal prosecution, professional sanction, and public humiliation beyond anything he had imagined possible when his carefully planned deception began months earlier. The afternoon session had transformed from routine divorce proceedings into criminal fraud exposure, with evidence suggesting that Marcus faced not merely unfavorable asset division, but potential imprisonment for systematic theft from the spouse who had actually funded every aspect of his apparent professional success throughout their marriage. Judge Morrison rose from her bench with the measured authority of someone prepared to deliver justice in its most complete and uncompromising form, her black robes flowing as she surveyed the wreckage of what had begun as routine divorce proceedings but had transformed into the exposure of systematic fraud that demanded severe judicial response. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as everyone present understood they were about to witness legal consequences commensurate with the scope of deception that had been revealed. "Mr. Thornfield," Judge Morrison began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial outrage barely contained within professional decorum. "In 30 years of presiding over family court proceedings, I have never encountered such comprehensive deception presented to this court as legitimate testimony. Your attempt to defraud both your spouse and this judicial system represents a level of calculated dishonesty that exceeds mere marital misconduct and enters the realm of criminal behavior." Marcus remained frozen in the witness chair, his expensive suit now wrinkled and damp with perspiration as he faced the complete destruction of everything he had attempted to achieve through months of careful planning and deliberate deception. His confident morning demeanor had been replaced by the hollow expression of someone watching their entire life collapse in real time under the weight of irrefutable evidence. Based on the comprehensive evidence presented by Mrs. Fleming, Judge Morrison continued with crisp authority, "This court finds that the defendant has systematically misrepresented asset ownership, concealed marital property, committed perjury in sworn testimony, and attempted to defraud the plaintiff of business interests she legitimately earned through substantial financial investment and professional contribution spanning 18 years of marriage." The judge paused to consult her extensive notes before delivering the financial judgment that would reshape both parties' lives permanently. "Therefore, this court awards complete ownership of Thornfield Associates, including all business assets, client relationships, and intellectual property, to Elizabeth Thornfield as sole proprietor. The defendant claims of independent ownership are rejected as fraudulent misrepresentation of partnership interests funded entirely by the plaintiff." Elizabeth maintained her dignified composure as she absorbed the magnitude of her legal victory, though careful observers might have noticed the subtle straightening of her shoulders as 18 years of hidden contributions received their first public acknowledgement and appropriate legal protection. Her patience and thorough preparation were being vindicated in the most complete manner possible. Furthermore, Judge Morrison announced with evident satisfaction at delivering appropriate consequences, the defendant's systematic use of marital assets to fund extramarital relationships constitutes deliberate waste of community property. This court therefore awards punitive damages of $500,000 to be paid from any remaining assets or future earnings until satisfied in full. Marcus' face had gone completely gray as he absorbed the financial implications of Judge Morrison's ruling, understanding that his attempt to escape marriage obligations with profitable asset division had instead resulted in complete financial destruction that would require years of rebuilding from absolute zero. His carefully planned deception had produced exactly the opposite outcome he had intended to achieve. The real property ownership records presented by Mrs. Fleming clearly established the plaintiff as sole owner of both the marital residence and vacation property. Judge Morrison continued with systematic thoroughness. The defendant has no legitimate claim to real estate purchased with the plaintiff independent funds and maintained in her name throughout their marriage. These properties remain under plaintiff exclusive ownership and control. The judge turned her attention to Marcus' business partnerships with visible disgust at the scope of deception she had witnessed throughout the afternoon proceedings. The evidence shows that Thornfield Associates was established using plaintiff capital investment, professional networking, and intellectual property contributions, while the defendant contributed minimal funding and falsely claimed sole ownership. This constitutes business fraud in addition to marital misconduct. Elizabeth attorney Patricia Fleming remained composed at her table, though her professional satisfaction at achieving complete client vindication was evident in her confident posture as Judge Morrison delivered judgment that exceeded even their most optimistic expectations. The comprehensive evidence Elizabeth had patiently assembled over 18 months of careful documentation was producing perfect legal consequences. Additionally, Judge Morrison announced with stern authority, "This court is referring evidence of attempted asset concealment and offshore account establishment to the district attorney for potential criminal prosecution. The defendant actions appear to constitute organized fraud that exceeds civil court jurisdiction and may warrant criminal charges, including grand theft and money laundering." Marcus began shaking visibly as the full scope of his legal exposure became clear, understanding that his problems extended far beyond unfavorable divorce settlement into potential imprisonment for crimes he had committed while attempting to defraud his wife. His confident morning testimony would likely be used as evidence of deliberate perjury in any subsequent criminal proceedings. The court also notes, Judge Morrison continued with evident distaste that the defendant used business accounts and marital assets to fund extramarital relationships while claiming poverty for settlement purposes. This demonstrates calculated deception designed to impoverish the plaintiff while maintaining access to her financial resources until the last possible moment before abandonment. Elizabeth rose gracefully as Judge Morrison concluded her comprehensive ruling, her movements reflecting the quiet dignity of someone whose character had been completely vindicated after years of private endurance of betrayal and systematic theft disguised as marriage partnership. Her gray eyes showed satisfaction rather than vindictive triumph as appropriate justice was finally delivered. "Mrs. Thornfield," Judge Morrison addressed Elizabeth directly with obvious respect for her patient endurance of comprehensive deception. "This court apologizes for the fraud that was initially presented as legitimate testimony. Your thorough documentation and professional competence have prevented a serious miscarriage of justice that would have rewarded systematic criminal behavior with financial advantage." Elizabeth nodded with gracious acceptance, her voice calm and clear as she addressed the court for the first time during the proceedings. "Thank you, Your Honor. I have always believed that truth and careful preparation would ultimately prevail over deception, regardless of how elaborate or confident that deception might appear initially. Justice has been appropriately served today." The bailiff approached Marcus with official paperwork documenting his comprehensive legal defeat, though his hands trembled too severely to accept the documents without assistance. His attempt to orchestrate profitable escape from marriage obligations had instead produced financial ruin, criminal exposure, and public humiliation that would follow him for years regardless of any subsequent career rebuilding efforts. Judge Morrison gathered her materials with visible satisfaction at having delivered justice in its most complete form, understanding that the evidence presented would likely result in additional criminal consequences for Marcus beyond the civil court financial destruction. The case would probably be studied in law schools as an example of comprehensive fraud exposure through patient evidence gathering. Elizabeth packed her briefcase with the same methodical precision she had displayed throughout the proceedings, though her movements now carried the confidence of someone whose 18 years of careful documentation had produced perfect vindication. Her investment in patient preparation rather than emotional confrontation had yielded results that exceeded anything hasty action could have achieved. 6 months later, Elizabeth sat in her newly redesigned office at what was now Elizabeth Thornfield Legal Services, reviewing client contracts for the nonprofit consulting business that had always generated substantial independent income but was now receiving appropriate recognition as sophisticated professional practice. Her gray hair was styled with confident elegance that reflected her liberation from pretending to be less capable than her actual abilities required. Marcus had been forced to accept an associate position at a competing firm where his salary barely covered basic living expenses and the punitive damages that Judge Morrison had imposed for his systematic theft of marital assets. His former colleagues treated him with the professional courtesy required by legal etiquette, but the personal respect he had once commanded had evaporated along with his fabricated success story. Vanessa had disappeared from Washington social circles entirely after learning that every luxury experience she had shared with Marcus had been stolen from his wife's accounts. Her humiliation too complete to allow continued residence in a city where everyone knew her as the unknowing recipient of organized marital theft. Her social media accounts had been deleted, her apartment abandoned, her dreams of upgrade lifestyle destroyed by association with comprehensive fraud. The Harrison Development Group and other major clients had transferred their business relationships directly to Elizabeth, understanding that she had been the actual relationship manager throughout the partnership that Marcus had falsely claimed as his independent achievement. Her professional reputation had emerged enhanced rather than damaged by the public exposure of her comprehensive competence. Elizabeth maintained her elegant composure in all professional interactions, though those who knew her well might have noticed the subtle satisfaction in her gray eyes when discussing business partnerships based on mutual respect rather than systematic deception. She had achieved not merely financial vindication, but personal liberation from pretending to be less than her actual capabilities for the comfort of masculine ego. Her quiet triumph represented perfect justice, served with patience and preparation rather than emotional revenge, proving that truth and careful documentation would ultimately prevail over even the most elaborate attempts at deception and theft. The woman who had been dismissed as unproductive domestic burden had emerged as sophisticated professional whose competence had been concealed rather than absent. Think about the people in your own life who might be underestimating someone they think they know completely. Have you ever discovered that someone you thought you understood actually had hidden depths or capabilities that surprised you? Share your thoughts in the comments about times when quiet competence proved more powerful than loud confidence. Because Elizabeth's story reminds us that the most dangerous opponent is often the one who appears to pose no threat at all.